Pastor John Stray from Peace Lutheran Church in Tacoma, in the Hilltop neighborhood of Tacoma. And I want to welcome you to this third in a series of 4 workshops on Native American justice. In January, we learned about dismantling the doctrine of discovery and land acknowledgments. In February, we explored the topic Native American boarding schools. And then now, today, we will be talking about decolonizing the first Thanksgiving. It's a provocative and challenging title, and we'll be getting into that just in a few moments. There is one more session left in this series of 4, and it will be happening in a little while. It's Tuesday, May 31st, when we will be viewing together the powerful documentary Dawnland. It's about cultural survival and stolen children in the Native American community and context, and there'll be more details coming about that. This series is being presented by Conversations Around Race. It's a collaborative effort of 4 different faith communities: Church of the Indian Fellowship, the Trinity Presbyterian Church, Peace Lutheran Church, and the Tacoma Friends Meeting. Ted Johnstone is the leader of this, the esteemed leader of this planning team. And over the years, we've been seeking to deepen our own understanding of racism in ourselves and in our communities, and then to take action toward justice. This is an ongoing journey. And we're determined to repent of the racism, the sin of racism in our past, recognize racism that is here and now, and do both of these with the goal of learning to live in right relationships with all people, and how that goal can bring us together as families, as a city, as a nation. We've hosted many events in the past over a 12-year period, and we've had these kinds of events. I'll list them off here: dialogues, pulpit exchanges, theater presentations with after-play discussions, storytelling events, blanket exercises, and workshops. We are so grateful for Associated Ministries for their partnership. Their partnership helps us to reach more folks in our Pierce County. And special thanks to Sandy Windley, who is bringing her gifts of administration and technology to help make this all happen. A few housekeeping items for you before I introduce our speaker, our main presenter today. We are recording this workshop, and so later on you'll be receiving that recording through access to that recording through Associated Ministries. You can let others know if they weren't able to see it, that they can connect to it. Resources for the workshop will be also offered for you that you can look at later. We hope your speaker volume is adequate for you. If it is not, please try to fix that on your end first. Do what you can to bring the volume up. Check your settings on your laptop or your device. And if you can't help yourself there, then you can put in the chat to Sandy that you could use a little bit of help, and we'll see if she's able to help you. If not, we ask you to just kind of bear with it, and it's possible that you can check out the recording later. Please use presenter view when Pastor Irvin Porter comes on as presenter. Then you won't be distracted by the other people's faces, and you'll be able to focus in on what Pastor Porter is saying. And finally, after his presentation, we ask you to stay around to participate in a discussion with some key reflection questions. We'll be in breakout groups. So when that happens, you'll see a tab and you'll click on that, and you will, after you click on it, you'll end up being in this breakout group. It'll be a chance to go deeper and explore more the topic of the day. Now it's time to introduce our speaker, Pastor Irvin Porter. Pastor Porter's pastor of Church of the Indian Fellowship, a friend of mine, a long standing leader in our conversations around race. The Church of the Indian Fellowship is on the land of the Puyallup tribe. Pastor Porter has served for 20 years in this faith community. For the past 8 years, he's been the Associate of Native American Intercultural Support for the Presbyterian Church USA. He serves as liaison to 95 different congregations, Native congregations distributed throughout the United States. So he is carrying a heavy load of being a local pastor as well as in ministry all over the United States. So we are incredibly blessed that he is giving his time and committing to lead these workshops with us, sharing his wisdom, his experience, his voice, his passion, his faith with us on these important topics of justice. I encourage you today to enter into this time with an open heart, with an open mind, with a willingness to grow and to learn and to be changed by what you hear and you experience tonight. Pastor Porter is married to Pastor Ann Cecile Porter. She's also an ordained Presbyterian minister. She serves currently as the staff chaplain at Multicare. Before Pastor Porter begins, please join me in a prayer that we have used to begin these workshops. We look to God. Oh God, call us into a deeper relationship with each other and teach us to be your people for the sake of the world. As we listen tonight, help us see with new eyes the injustice and oppression in our nation's history and within church and society today. Call us to have a loving heart that respects and uplifts the humanity and dignity of every person. Open our ears to listen to and learn from the experiences of people of color. Open our mouths to speak up about injustice wherever and whenever we see it. Breathe your spirit over us, O God, and help us all work for racial equity and inclusion for all people. Amen. Pastor Porter.
Thank you, John. Welcome, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to share with you. We welcome those of you who have been part of our workshops. This is the third one now, and we hope to see you also at the end of at the end of May, on the 30th, when we have the screening of the Dawnland video. Let me share my screen here. We began, as we do each of our workshops, with the Native American land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land we will discuss this evening is the Patuxet, was the territory of the Mashpee Wampanoag, also known as the people of the first light, and have inhabited present-day Massachusetts and eastern Rhode Island for more than 12,000 years. After many years of trying, they were finally acknowledged as a federally recognized tribe in 2017. In 2015, the federal government declared 150 acres of land in Mashpee and 170 acres of land in Taunton as the tribe's initial reservation, on which the tribe can exercise its full tribal sovereignty rights. They have 2,600 enrolled citizens. Paula Peters was a second grade student in Philadelphia in the mid-1960s. And one time in her classroom, she was listening to, and the other students were listening to their teacher talk about Plymouth Colony and the Mayflower, when another student asked the teacher, what happened to the Indians who helped the Pilgrims settle the Wampanoag? The teacher said, they were all dead. And Paula said, When she mentioned we're all dead, that was devastating. I raised my hand and I said, that's not true. I'm Wampanoag and I'm still here. 5 weeks after docking the Mayflower in November of 1620, the Pilgrims sailed away to find better land suited for their crops that they wanted to grow. And so they ended up in Patuxent, the Wampanoag name for the area where Plymouth colony would be built. Contact with Europeans brought plague, disease, and just about wiped out the Wampanoag. So it's not so much a cause for celebration to the Wampanoag or any other Native American people. For many Wampanoag, Thanksgiving has always been considered a day of mourning because of that epidemic and the centuries of American Indian removal policies that followed. Native people were moved to make way for a new people, a people seeking religious freedom, a people looking for another start. The picture on the upper left is of my grandparents, Helen and Richard Moffat, on their 45th wedding anniversary trip to Hawaii. And by the way of full disclosure, I am descended from one of those Mayflower ancestors. My grandmother, Helen Moffat, was not Native American. She is of Norwegian English descent. Through her English ancestry, the Mayflower Passenger, John Alden, is my 8th great grandfather. Alden, a maker of barrels known as a cooper, was given the option to stay in America or return to England with the Mayflower crew. He decided to stay. He later married Priscilla Mullins, and one of the first love stories in America began, so history records. You may wonder how that heritage processes in a Native American to know that his ancestry is responsible for one of the first successful invasions of this land. But it wasn't the first time in my family genealogy either. In 1890, the original Nez Perce Reservation in Idaho was opened for white settlement. My second great grandfather, John Herman Sanford, pictured with his family in the lower center, whose ancestry reaches back to those Pilgrims, was among the first white settlers to purchase Nez Perce land to farm upon what is now Nez Perce, Idaho. The money for the sale of those lands did not go to the Nez Perce. It went directly to the federal government. Their descendants still live, and my ancestors and relatives still live in the Nez Perce area of Idaho, pictured on the lower right. And they're surrounded by towns. Because my grandmother married my grandfather, a Nez Perce Indian, she was shunned by her relatives for most of her life. And my grandfather's family weren't much happier about the marriage either. Native people are rarely identified by tribe in the original narrative of the Pilgrim history. The word Indian is what they're usually called, a name given by a lost explorer in 1492 who thought he had reached India. The Wampanoag, which is a Narragansett word, which means Easterners, maintained that the first Thanksgiving myth sugarcoats the cruelty of colonialism for indigenous people. Tradition says the Pilgrims stepped off the Mayflower into, quote, a new world, unquote, or wilderness, when in fact, human civilization was every bit as rich and ancient in that new world as it was in Europe. Humans settled in the Americas much earlier than previously thought, according to new evidence from Mexico. Indigenous people have been living in the Western Hemisphere for over 33,000 years, twice the widely accepted age for the earliest settlement of the Americas. History did not begin with the Mayflower. They weren't frozen in some kind of strange Stone Age existence until Europeans arrived. They already had a dynamic past, countless generations old, that shaped who they were and what they did, including how they responded to the English. In other words, they already inhabited a very old world. If anyone did any discovering, it was the indigenous peoples of the Americas over 33,000 years ago. But they didn't kill, spread diseases, or enslave the inhabitants of the land because there were not any. The only thing new to the native people were the invaders from the east. This continent was described by the Pilgrims and those who tried to exploit the land before them as being full of villages, roads, cornfields, historic monuments, cemeteries, and forests cleared of underbrush, all by indigenous design. Their recent history mattered too. The Thanksgiving myth says that this was first contact episode. It was not. It is just one of many bloody contacts between the Wampanoag and the Europeans since 1524, in particular from 1602 onward. The Thanksgiving myth always depicts the indigenous people of America as fearful and scared by the invaders, but in fact, they were the stronger of the two parties. The colonists had everything to lose. The indigenous people did not. The Thanksgiving myth played a minor role in this relationship, far more influential in shaping the alliance between Wampanoag and English were a series of less agreeable chapters filled with violence and power politics. In his book, The Land Was Their Land, This Land Was Their Land, author Professor David J. Silverman, George Washington University, a Jewish American, notes that describing the Thanksgiving myth as white lie requires tracing Wampanoag's struggles with colonialism through the centuries up to the present day, which his scholarship has done very well. To the Wampanoag, this alliance between indigenous and English was little more than colonists' failure to keep the 1621 alliance when the Pilgrims settled at Plymouth. At the Plymouth settlement in present-day Massachusetts, the leaders of the Plymouth colonists, acting on behalf of King James I of England, made a defensive alliance with Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoags. In the agreement, both parties promised not to do hurt to one another. It was the first treaty between Native American tribes and a group of American colonists. According to the treaty, if the Wampanoag broke the peace, that person would be sent to Plymouth for punishment. If a colonist broke the law, he would be sent to the Wampanoag. But 55 years later, the Wampanoag described that relationship as the Wampanoag being a great man and the English being little children. They could have wiped out the English, but they held back their native enemies, fed the starving colonists, and gave them land. The Wampanoag needed allies. Plagues in 1616 and 1619 nearly wiped out their tribe and left their enemies, the Narragansett, stronger. Histories throughout the ages have left out certain information that didn't fit into their narrative of the brave English pilgrims seeking freedom of religion. A true testament to the adage that history is written by those who conquered. Plymouth would have been another lost colony without the Wampanoag. How did they show their gratitude now? And they had become the great man and the Wampanoag, the child. Over half of the Wampanoag became Christians, renounced their Wampanoag leadership. They had learned to read and write in their own languages from the mission schools. The deceitful taking of lands only became worse and worse. Soon the English had more lands than the Wampanoag. It was a shakedown by the Pilgrims who had short memories and thin loyalties to their indigenous allies. The mindset of ethnocentric logic that Europeans were far more superior than any indigenous population was obviously at play. But it happened more than once in human history. The British needed the people in India, the royal elite, to help them take over that country, to take it over with their military might, then to enrich themselves off the natural resources, spices, and other crops of lucrative value. They did the same thing in China. It's like they couldn't accomplish that on this continent, so they took it on the road in the East. But Spain and Portugal are no less guilty for doing the same things around the world, particularly in South America and Mexico. For the New England settlers of the 1600s, this English arrogance was met with war, which began quickly. The English compounded the problem by treating the thousands of Christian Indians who pledged loyalty to the colonies at the start of the war as wolves in sheep's clothing. The Christian Indians were imprisoned onto island concentration camps where the native people suffered malnutrition and exposure. Some of the captured Indians were sold into the horrors of slavery into the Caribbean, West Indies, Gibraltar, and North Africa. Some had surrendered on English promises of mercy, only to discover that the terms were harsher than colonial officials had pledged. Native American slavery is a piece of the history of slavery that has been glossed over. Between 1492 and 1880, between 2 and 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved in the Americas, in addition to 12.5 million African slaves. While natives have been forced into slavery and servitude as early as 1636, it was not until King Phillips War that natives were enslaved in large numbers. In 1675 and 1676, war pitted Native American leader Metacom, called King Philip by his English name, and his allies against the English colonial settlers. During that war, New England colonies routinely shipped Native Americans as slaves to Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, the Azores, Spain, and Tangier in North Africa. But that's another workshop. The sin of slavery was far more vast on this continent than American history has ever covered or covered up. Worse still, some surrendering natives learned too late that colonial authorities would not spare any Indians who were suspected of having taken English lives. Massachusetts, the town of Plymouth, and Rhode Island held public executions through the summer of 1676, including 50 hangings on Boston Common alone. There is no memorial, by the way, to these events. The Boston Massacre site marker is located at the intersection of State and Congress Streets in downtown Boston, outside the old State House, a few yards away from where the massacre of 500 Native people took place. Today, a medallion of the Freedom Trail marks the site of the Boston Massacre, and reenactments hosted by Bostonian Society take place on the anniversary each year. But there is not one mention in Boston Common of public executions of Indigenous people. No memorial to their lives, the freedom they fought so hard to keep. This is only one example of the distortion of American history being written by the conquerors. White Bostonians executed more Native Americans for their participation in the conflict known as King Phillips War. This was also known as the First Indian War, the Great Narragansett War, or Metacom's Rebellion, and took place in southern New England from 1675 to 1676. It was the Indigenous people's last-ditch effort to avoid recognizing English authority and stop English settlement on their lands. Metacom, also known as Pometacom, Metacom, and by his adopted English name, King Philip, was sachem, chief of a confederation of Algonquin tribes of the North Atlantic coast, to the Wampanoag people, and the second son of the sachem, Massasoit. Massasoit was sachem who forged critical political and personal ties with the Plymouth colonial leadership. Ties which grew out of a peace treaty negotiated March 22nd, 1621. The alliance ensured that the Pokanockets remained neutral during the Pequot War in 1836. According to English sources, Massasoit prevented the failure of the Plymouth colony and the starvation that the Pilgrims faced during those first years. It was Massasoit who sent Squanto to live among the Pilgrims, to report back what they were doing, planning, and to help them with crops that the Pilgrims were unfamiliar with in Europe. The execution in Boston Commons were payback for a 2-year conflict between followers of Wampanoag sachem Metacom, colonists in New England, and their Native American allies. The executions were the result of one of the most brutal conflicts in the history of the American colonies and later the United States. Filled with vengeance, Metacom's head was sent to Plymouth. There, on the very site where the chief's father had made a treaty and feasted with the Pilgrims, authorities mounted their grisly trophy outside the town gate and left it there for 20 years. It's likely one of the last things that Metacom's wife saw before the good people of Plymouth shipped her and many other Wampanoag into slavery. Later that week, Plymouth held a day of Thanksgiving, 55 years after the treaty negotiated by Massasoit in 1621, father of Metacom, in praise of God for saving the colony from its enemy. It's this celebration that many Native Americans fixate upon as the Thanksgiving for a massacre of indigenous people of that territory. Those who were considered the enemies of the white settlers. The goodwill of the native people in the past did not matter at all. This was the manifest destiny logic of colonial Americans. Manifest destiny is a phrase which came into use in 1845. It is the philosophy, the idea that the United States is destined by God, its advocates believed, to expand its domain and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. The philosophy drove 19th century US territorial expansion and was used to justify the forced removal of Native Americans and other groups from their homes. This has been the story and still is the same outcome throughout, though not as gruesome today. But the slander, the racism, and the ill will has been passed down from one generation of Americans to the next. Native Americans are not trying to change the history of America. That history is done and it cannot be changed. Native Americans are trying to decolonize, desanitize the history of this country to reflect the truth, the alliances and the goodwill of its indigenous people more accurately toward those pilgrims seeking their religious liberty, those who were in need, the weak and the poor, the starving and the dying at alarming rates in a tiny village of Plymouth. How soon they forgot the truths of their sacred book. How soon they forgot that truth. How utterly tragic that the history that was taught and continues to be taught to our next generations distorts all these truths. So a new narrative had to be created. That kindly pilgrims invited the poor heathen Indians to a meal of Thanksgiving to celebrate their first harvest in the New World. How disingenuous to wipe clean the slate of atrocities visited upon the undermanned and outgunned indigenous people whose only defense were bows and arrows against state-of-the-art weapons of mass destruction. This conflict was just the first stage of the 1600s for the indigenous people's long battle to defend their lands and sovereignty, a struggle that continues to this day. It should come as no surprise that English seized all Wampanoag territory after the war, leaving only a handful of village-sized reservations, mostly for Christian Indians. The Wampanoag did not lose their land. Colonists and their successors took it. They also seized the Wampanoags as slave labor. The Dakota and other tribes in Minnesota didn't lose their lands. It was taken from them after what is now called the Sioux Uprising of 1862. The Nez Perce didn't lose their lands in Eastern Oregon. It was taken from them after what is now called the Nez Perce War of 1877. Many of these small Eastern tribes didn't lose their lands. They were taken from them when they were forced into boarding schools, resettled into major cities across the country, or ordered to leave those lands because they now belonged to the federal, state, or local governments for the good of white Americans who needed it. And besides, in all these examples, much of those lands were not being used by the native people anyway, so they were told. Terra nullius, a Latin expression meaning nobody's land, a principle used in international law to justify claims that territory may be acquired by a state's occupation of it. In the 1860s and early 1870s, Massachusetts addressed the stubborn refusal of the Wampanoag to disappear by dissolving their reservations. The state divided it into private property tracts, subjected those lands to taxation and confiscation for debt, and then declared the inhabitants to be fully fledged citizens and no longer Indians, as if the two were hostile. This is the exact same pattern of theft used by the succeeding US government to claim lands of indigenous peoples from sea to shining sea. You may remember that the original doctrine of discovery, which explorers used as their roadmap to conquest of the Americas, allowed for the subjugation of all non-Christian inhabitants of the land, which could lead to their enslavement or reasons for being killed. Over the centuries, white Americans did everything they could to make that supposed natural process occur, including reducing Indians to romantic bit parts in the country's historic and now seen in the Thanksgiving myth. Racism had gone from an idea and way of life to a documented reason for being. The Wampanoag and other tribes went from being named to being a category of minuscule part in the first Thanksgiving narrative being developed for national consumption, and an enemy of the American ethos of rugged individualism, religious independence, and Caucasian ethnocentrism. The narrative went from mentioning the names of Massasoit and Squanto to just being mentioned as Indians. From saving the dying Pilgrim community with food, healing remedies, then food crop workshops, to being unwanted guests at a celebration with the claim that Indians invited themselves to that meal. Popular historic memory is an odd phenomenon. By definition, it is the intersection between past and present. In the best case, it's informed, at least somewhat, by historical evidence, but it's always influenced by contemporary situations as well. This means that one of the best ways to track the changing values of a culture is to examine how popular memory of a particularly historic event differs over time. The memory of the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving is a case in point. The pictures on the right side of this slide show the popular thought of the first Thanksgiving, first as a benevolent act of the Pilgrims inviting the Indians to their meal, giving thanks for the first harvest in a new land. Yet notice that in this picture, at least, the Indians are seated at the table by themselves. In some pictures of this event, the Indians are seated on the ground. Then the value over time changed from the Indian, from being guests to invasive, murdering marauders whose only purpose was to kill the white man. In this picture, they are not only killing the musket-bearing white men fighting them, but innocent children as well. The idea being that the Indian was mercilessly savage toward the kind white people who only wanted religious freedom. Throughout the colonial era, Thanksgiving had no association with Pilgrims and Indians. The link appears to date from 1841, when Reverend Alexander Young published an account of a 1621 harvest feast hosted by Plymouth Colony and attended by neighboring Wampanoag. The history of popular memory of the first Thanksgiving falls neatly into two broad periods, separated by a crucial event in the year 1841. The first of the two is the simplest to characterize. 220 years after the Pilgrims' 1621 harvest celebration, memory of the event as defining event in American history was almost non-existent. One known record of the event, an original Pilgrim, Edward Winslow, mentions it in a letter to someone in England, sketching how the Mayflower passengers fared since they arrived in Plymouth. The letter, published in 1621, includes a 115-word description of the event now known as the first Thanksgiving. This picture of Edward Winslow was made in 1651. The pamphlet containing the description was published in England under the modest title, A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and Proceedings of the English Plantation Settled at Plymouth in New England by Certain English, Adventures both merchants and others, with a difficult passage, their safe arrival, their joyful building of and comfortable planting themselves in the now well-defined town of New Plymouth. The printer who actually published this book was one G. Mort, and the pamphlet was has been known ever since by the mercifully shorter title, Mort's Relation. In the 17th century, the word relation was just another word for report or account. Rare in England, Mort's Relation was rarer still in the American colonies. And by the beginning of the 18th century, there was probably not a single copy of it in all of New England. With neither oral tradition nor a written record to keep it alive, the 1621 event gradually faded until it vanished entirely. With neither oral tradition nor a written record, this is the entire primary source, alleged historical account of the first Thanksgiving. A small footnote at the bottom of a page of text about it, Young writes, "This was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England." Over the next 50 years, by 1891, various authors, artists, lecturers, and politicians spread this idea until Americans took it for granted. When you tell a lie or enhance the truth of a matter long enough, people begin to believe it as truth. As memory of the first Thanksgiving died away, the celebration of Thanksgiving became more popular, not less. New Englanders were the first to claim the Pilgrims as national founders and their dinner with the Indians as a model for Thanksgiving. The original Pilgrims had been very skeptical of regular holy days. Remember that our word holiday comes by combining the two words holy and day. The Pilgrims associated regular holidays with the perceived abuses of Catholicism, and in general, the only true holy day that they celebrated regularly was the Lord's Day every Sunday. Their descendants, however, gradually forgot or rejected their ancestors' hostility to regularly scheduled holidays. While the custom of springtime fasts really never caught on outside of Plymouth, the celebration of regular autumn Thanksgivings spread across New England during the 18th century, expanded into the Midwest after the War of 1812, and began to catch on in the Upper South by the 1840s. Thanksgiving was becoming a beloved American holiday, not just one linked to the Pilgrims. Today, it seems, the only emphasis on Pilgrims is in adult costume parties and in our public schools. We all remember the drill. Every November, the bulletin boards are covered with black and white clad pilgrims with buckles on their shoes, corn harvest stalks stacked into neat bundles in the fields, Indian corn, of course, turkeys, both live and otherwise, and Indians. But for the rest of the nation to go along, they had to first conquer the tribes of the Great Plains and the Far West. Only then could white America stop vilifying them as bloodthirsty and give them an unthreatening role in a national founding myth. The irony being, the Wampanoag and other Eastern tribes met the Pilgrims with friendship and even brotherhood, helped them to survive a winter which was seeing their numbers dropping through death, helped them to cultivate North American crops they had never seen, pumpkin, squash, corn, and vegetables of all kinds. It took the constant theft of their lands by these colonists, elimination of wildlife by the clearing of forests for farms, dissemination of fish populations through water diversion for farming, and finally, warfare. A war which history remembers as King Phillips War, no matter that it wasn't started by the indigenous people in the first place. Have you ever noticed that throughout American history, when indigenous people won a battle, it was called a massacre? But when Euro-American settlers won, it's called a battle. The word war is only added to these battles or massacres when the native people lost. The Nez Perce War of 1877, King Philip's War, Pontiac's War, the Pequot War, and the title given to the collective fighting with Native Americans is called the Indian Wars. The Pilgrim story took hold because it had use in the nation's cultural wars. It's no coincidence that the Pilgrims emerged as national founders among the popular concern that the United States was being overrun by Catholics, Jews, and the Orthodox Christian immigrants who were supposed to be ungrateful to the country's democratic Protestant origins and values. Treating the Pilgrims as a representation of colonial America served to minimize the country's racist oppression, past and present. The story would go over better if the Pilgrims' religious and democratic principles, instead of the Indian wars of slavery, were lifted up. Though Americans eventually assumed that the Thanksgiving holiday had been associated with Pilgrims and Indians since 1621, that tradition was the product of white Protestants in the 19th century. Northeast America was declared their cultural authority over European immigrants. They would teach them what being American really was. Americans of color and other regions of the United States. This narrative became tradition by the early 20th century, and it remains so because of children's annual pageants to reenact this myth. The point was to have a diverse group of school children learn about who we as Americans are, or at least who we're supposed to be. Even students from ethnic backgrounds would be taught the principles of democracy, liberty, Christianity, and learning to identify with English colonists as fellow whites. Designed to get everyone to identify with the English as fellow white people, leaving Indians outside the category of my fathers, also carried important lessons. It becomes yet another reminder of who ran the country and whose values mattered. Authentic Indians were supposed to be primitive relics frozen in a Stone Age time, not modern people. So what were they doing in school? Speaking English, wearing contemporary clothing, and returning home to adults who had jobs and drove cars. Today, teachers are less likely to have advanced degrees in history, historic subject matter. Their coursework is about academic methods, not content, and so are more likely to fall back on memories of what they themselves learned in school, recreating the good times that they enjoyed as children learning about the first Thanksgiving. One third grade teacher in Des Moines, Iowa, recently shared that some of her colleagues have been reluctant to update the Thanksgiving lessons because they have, quote, such fond memories of the Thanksgiving activities they did in school, unquote. By 1970, Frank James, pictured in the lower right of this slide, Wampanoag, a Native American progressive historian, had reached the limits of his patience with this nonsense. He was born and raised in the community of Gay Head on Martha's Vineyard, which has long ranked as one of the poorest communities in Massachusetts. You've all heard of it, an island located south of Cape Cod, known for being a popular summer colony for the rich and the well-placed in society, playground of presidents. It is the 58th largest island in the United States, with a land area of about 96 miles. Frank James was invited to speak at the state's banquet celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Plymouth colony founding. He saw it as a rare opportunity to set the record straight. Yet, when he submitted a draft of his speech for review, white officials rejected it as, quote, too inflammatory, unquote. James found an alternative script drawn up by the state to be so childish and untrue that he pulled out of the event altogether. Instead, he drew up plans for a commemoration where there would be no censors. Inspired by the Red Power or American Indian movement of indigenous rights and justice, James organized a national day of mourning to be held on Thanksgiving Day in 1970 at the site of the Massasoit statue overlooking Plymouth Rock. It has been held on the fourth Thursday of each November ever since. Thanksgiving Day 2022 will mark the 52nd year of the National Day of Mourning. It seeks to educate the American public about the indigenous peoples in the United States, particularly the Wampanoag and other tribes of the eastern United States, dismiss myths surrounding the Thanksgiving story, and raise awareness about historical and ongoing struggles facing Native American tribes. In choosing this name for the occasion, James not only reached back into National Days of Mourning held after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., he also reached back to commemorations for indigenous leaders in history. When James' moment came, he stood before the indigenous protesters from across the country, the media, and the onlookers, and delivered the, quote, inflammatory speech, unquote, Massachusetts tried to suppress. He began with a sharp affirmation that he had the right to the dignity of his humanity despite society's efforts to diminish him and his people. He said, quote, "We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing it was the beginning of the end, that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people," unquote. To James, the moral of the first Thanksgiving was that the English and their white successors had betrayed the Wampanoag who had befriended them in their time of need. This is the message that has echoed through later national days of mourning, which United Native Americans of New England have continued to hold each Thursday, each Thanksgiving, and will hold again on Thursday, November 24th, 2022. How do we all move forward? The answer, according to James, is to confront this history, including the fact, as he put it, that the Wampanoag still walk the lands of Massachusetts. James also urges Americans to consider Indians as worthy of the same respect as everyone else. To remember the Indian is and was as human as the white man. The Indian feels pain and becomes defensive, has dreams, bears tragedy and failure, suffers from loneliness, needs to cry as well as laugh. There are so many reasons for Americans to follow James' lead and attempt to tell the history of Plymouth and Thanksgiving with three-dimensional Wampanoag at the center. Thanksgiving overshadows Columbus Day as a focal point of considering the Native Americans' role in the nation's past. It's bad enough to have gotten the story so wrong for so long. It's inexcusable to continue the annual tradition of having teachers, politicians, and television producers traffic in the Thanksgiving myth and residential homes and the shopping centers sport decorations of happy pilgrims and Indians. Those kinds of stereotypes dismiss Native people's real historic traumas at the hands of colonists and their descendants in favor of depicting their ancestors as consenting to colonialism. We have suffered greatly as Americans. So America can continue a myth that pats themselves on the back as having been fair and honest to the indigenous people of this land which was indigenous land, since the Creator placed us upon it and where we have lit our fires ever since. A land whose first songs, first prayers were those of her indigenous people then and now. Native Americans have served the military services of the nation's wars all the way back to the beginning and up to the present time. In a multicultural country, it's supposed to be morally unacceptable to allow the myth of the first Thanksgiving to damage a nation's people. There are many challenges, and many Americans are not comfortable about what some label as revisionist history. Some would rather keep telling the myth, stereotypes, and lies, and not rock the boat. Revisionist means an advocate of revision, especially of some political or religious doctrine, a reviser, any advocate of doctrine, theories, or practices that depart from established authority or doctrine. This truth-telling, these ancient ideas, these suggestions from indigenous people are threats to American society because they dismantle the colonial absolutes that have been taught to succeeding generations from 1620 until this very day. That is why this truth-telling is a threat. We have just heard, however, that the story many of us learned in school about that first Thanksgiving is inaccurate at best, racist, and paternalistic in many ways, with a focus on manifest destiny idea of God's mandate for Europeans to conquer the new world in the name of Jesus Christ and country. There has been too little public attention about how the Thanksgiving myth teaches white prosperity of the nation. Why should a school-aged child of color from a different race identify more with the Pilgrims than the Indians? After all, those students are unlikely to descend from either group, or the descendants of both groups are fellow Americans. If a student can be taught to think of both groups as they rather than we, it might be a step toward a more significant understanding of history in which everybody can be seen as fully human with all of the qualities and shortcomings that we would expect to see in any population. But at the same time, if the student is taught to think of both groups in a way that includes everyone as we, aware that some may use it to their own purposes, it might be a step toward a more caring American society. What if we have school curriculums treat Native Americans in history as basic to an understanding of American history in general? Side by side, the classwork would present the civilizations indigenous peoples created over thousands of years before the European arrival. A friend of mine, Randy Woodley, is a Kituwa Cherokee teacher, poet, activist, former pastor, missiologist, and historian. The history that he gives this advice for Americans confronting the first Thanksgiving myth. Decolonization is as much a process as a goal. It requires a profound recentering of indigenous worldviews in our movements for political liberation, social transformation, renewed cultural kinships, and the development of an economic system that serves rather than threatens our collective life on this planet. As stated by Toronto-based activist Saeed Hussein, decolonization is a dramatic reimagining of relationships with land, people, and the state. Much of this requires study. It requires conservation. It is a practice. It is an unlearning. In spite of our ugly history, no, actually, because of these atrocities, I want to suggest that we all continue to celebrate Thanksgiving, but with a caveat. Settler folks must be educated to realize that Thanksgiving in America didn't begin with the Pilgrims. For thousands of years, many feasts of Thanksgiving have been characteristic of all our Indian tribes. This phenomenon continues today. Settler immigrants should reorient their thinking to view that first Thanksgiving as the first opportunity for them to join millennial-old traditions among America's indigenous peoples to thank God, who was already present before they arrived, and thank the land upon which they were living. Many people ask if Native Americans celebrate Thanksgiving Day. And as with many questions about Native people, there are many different viewpoints on that question. For some, like myself, it is a day which focuses on family, friends, food, fellowship, and gratitude to God for our many blessings. 3 of my brothers have passed, but their families remind us of the blessings they were and which still remain with us. For Christian Native people, it is a day for all those things and the time to pause with gratitude to God for the blessings bestowed upon us and to pray that God's blessings will continue into the new year ahead. But being thankful to God is not just for one day out of a year either. It is a way of life for Native people, regardless of their religious views. Native people are raised with the knowledge that the Creator takes care of us and provides for us as well. You may be saying, well, that sounds like Christian belief to me. And you'd be right. There are many Christian values that were already part of Native American lifeways. And as many of you know, Thanksgiving Day is a day not only for family, food, fun, but also the Dallas Cowboys. Yeah. Sorry. It's ironic that Thanksgiving takes place in a place where the Native people are not very welcomed. When I was growing up in West Phoenix, Thanksgiving Day was sometimes when my dad, a single parent, would pile all 8 of us kids into a car and we would drive to the east side of the valley where many of our relatives lived and still live today. It was a time of playing with cousins, seeing all kinds of relatives, and enjoying a great Thanksgiving dinner. Lots of leftovers went home with us too. Many Native people utilized the holiday to get together with family and friends, to share a large meal without once thinking of the first Thanksgiving in 1621. When we gathered on Thanksgiving Day, whether with our relatives or in our own home, we were thinking about family, food, and being thankful to God who provided it all. Yet there are many Native Americans for whom Thanksgiving Day is a terrible reminder of what the arrival of the Pilgrims and other European colonists led to. Loss of lands, either by treaty or theft, arrival of unknown diseases which annihilated millions of Native American people, sometimes completely decimating tribes, destruction of the environment which sustained wildlife, water sources, plants, both wild and cultivated, as well as intolerance for their ancient religion. It's ironic that Thanksgiving takes place during American Indian and Alaska Native Heritage Month. And even greater irony is that more Americans today identify the day after Thanksgiving as Black Friday than as National American Indian Heritage Day, which it has been designated. Like the Wampanoag, thousands of Native American nations and communities across the continent had their own stories and cultures. Native peoples were and continue to be an essential part of the story of the United States of America. Native people wish only to encourage that teachings about Thanksgiving be done in a way that recognizes contributions of his country's original people and gives real meaning to November as American Indian Heritage Month. The agricultural practices and traditional foods of Native people would be a good starting point, since the abundant Thanksgiving feast of turkey, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, and gravy would not even exist if it were not for the knowledge, the ingenuity of Native peoples of the Americas. Truth and reconciliation is needed in telling the story of the first Thanksgiving. Yes, there are many Native Americans who celebrate Thanksgiving Day, but how they do so is as varied as the foods that they helped introduce into the world, which had been growing on this continent centuries before. Yes, there are many Native Americans who see Thanksgiving Day as a national day of mourning for the loss of culture, languages, lands, and especially the loss of countless tribal people to disease, wars, and genocide perpetrated upon them for over 500 years. For me, a Native American minister of the Presbyterian Church USA, the hope of my faith in Jesus Christ and the blessings given to family, friends, and our country is my focus, not just on the fourth Thursday of each November, but also the other 364 days of the year. Psalm 9, verse 1. I will give thanks to you, Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonderful deeds. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Reverend Porter, for all you've given us this evening. It's been a feast for our hearts and for our minds, and we're truly thankful to you for that. It's time now to move into discussion groups where we can process and enhance much of what we've just heard from Reverend Porter. So in a moment, we're going to form groups of 6, and they'll be created randomly, so we're more likely to hear and learn from a variety of perspectives. It'll be each group's responsibility to discuss the questions I'm about to reveal in our Zoom chat. And at the end of your 20 minutes together, to bring out of your group any questions you might have for Reverend Porter when we reconvene.
I'm not sure what group I was in.
Yeah, I don't remember what, maybe we were group, should we be group 4? Our group?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, Christy.
Robin, is it okay if I ask this question that you put together, or would you like to? Is that okay? Okay. So Reverend Porter, we had a great conversation in our group, and Robin came up with this as our question, and it has to do with this next Thanksgiving. Interested how would you recommend centering our gatherings around gratitude and including gratitude for the story of the first people as they taught and welcomed the Pilgrims? And part of that also is, how do we start to change the narrative in our own spheres of influence at our own Thanksgiving tables and gatherings? What would lead to more openness and conversation rather than us abusing the opportunity, she said, to lecture or share? I mean, there is a way to have a conversation around it and pull people into the conversation, and there's a way to ruin Thanksgiving and push people away. So how do we make it so that we're pulling people into that conversation? So in Thanksgivings of the future, we are more mindful of what the actual story is.
Good questions. I really, as you were unpacking those questions, I really started thinking about what Randy Woodley said. You're approaching an event, a Thanksgiving, a time of being thankful and celebration and whatever you want to call it, that has been going on on this continent for thousands of years. And that's a good place to start. The fact that what we're doing today is not new. This continent has seen this before, and in many, many different ways. Different tribes have it different ways. And there's I think it's a Shawnee Prayer that you can look up online, and it's very, very long. I found it, and we actually used it at the church one year. We normally have a potluck dinner the Sunday before Thanksgiving. And so during that meal, instead of an opening prayer or Thanksgiving prayer, we used that particular prayer, and it was very, very long, so we had it printed. But it thanks the Creator for the trees and the waters and the mountains, and it just goes on. And the people are respond. There's a response part of it all. But that would be a good way to start it, that you're not doing anything in being thankful that hasn't been going on this continent for thousands of years. That's the first thing he told us. The second thing would be about changing the narrative. Ideas about that are, maybe you could find out some little, on some events, you'll have on the table a little card. I think they call them discussion starters, a little card, and it'll have a few little facts and stuff like that. That's a good idea, and you could use that information about the Native people. Not a lot of people have ever heard of that tribe, the Wampanoag. I was fortunate to meet a lady who was from that tribe, who lived in a nursing home in Seattle. And she had asked, she called the church and she said, I want to have a Native pastor come and talk with me. And I said, sure. So I went, made the long drive up there to her nursing home, visited with her. And I had more questions for her than anything, because I had never met anybody from that tribe ever. And so I had a ton of questions for her. And she'd been living in the Seattle area since after the Second World War, when she and her husband settled here after they were working in the munitions plants. And so that's how she ended up over here. And the family asked me to conduct her funeral. And so that was quite an honor, but I learned a lot from her. Again, there's just a lot of people who don't know the name of that tribe. They were Indians as far as they know, but that kind of goes to what I said, that the proper names of people were taken out of the storyline, and they were just called Indians, so people don't know who they were. But anyway, there's a lot of ways that you could do that to kind of give some information and help people to learn. And that's what these workshops are all about. It's not for you to just hear this information, but I'm hoping that you're going to turn around and be able to share this with people that you know, and information. That's why we give you those resource lists as well, so that you can find out more information about what I'm talking to you about. But yeah, those would be some ways that you could do that. And it's not trying to change the narrative, or whatever you want to call it, of Thanksgiving, as much as it's trying to give some acknowledgement to the fact that, did you know that Native Americans were the first to introduce pumpkins and squash and corn to those pilgrims and stuff like that? And I mean, the list is longer than that, however, but there's a lot that you can do and find out. There's good resources online, and if you go to the National Museum of the American Indian webpage, they have many, many resources on there that they put on, that they produce for teachers. And so a lot of the documents have been prepared by Native American scholars. And so they're sound, they've been checked, they've been vetted, if you will, and all of that. And so there's some good resources that are out there. If there's a tribe, such as the Puyallup here in Tacoma, or any of the tribes around the country where somebody lives, they could ask some information about them too. And that really then kind of gets you into what we're talking about that we do at the beginning, is our land acknowledgement, Native American land acknowledgement. And that kind of goes to it as well. That information, that little couple of paragraphs that I speak about as we begin these workshops, is also good information for people to know, that those people who've been here those centuries long, they're still here. And many, unfortunately, are not. They've been removed and they're exterminated now. They're no longer people of different tribes around the country, but we're still here. That's a good start.
Thank you. We seem to be lacking in breakout group identity. So first come, first serve. Who representing a group wishes to present a question? Patricia.
You're on mute, Pat.
There we go. Okay. Thank you. One of the questions that we had in that group was what is a 10-minute version of the information you just gave us that we could share with people? But I think you covered that already. So the next question that we have is, what happened to the Black Indians? What happened if you, I don't have this quite right. Pamela, could you help me out with this? I'm sorry.
Oh, I think you stated the question succinctly. Thank you so much, Reverend Porter. I think you get the gist. If you would like me to add, I can, but I think the question stands.
For those of you who don't know what that means, throughout the history of African people being brought to this continent, as we know, many of them possibly ran away from their owners or were set free, whatever the case was, that many of African American descendants or ancestors ended up with Native American people. They took them in, befriended them. Unfortunately, there were tribes who did enslave them. In fact, when some of those, the Cherokee went on that Trail of Tears to Oklahoma to be resettled, they had slaves. Some of them had slaves with them. And eventually those slaves were freed, but they had become like family after a while. They raised the children and all those things. And so eventually they were freed. And at least in that tribe, they became members of the tribe. And then about 15 years ago, the descendants of those people known as freemen were, it was decided by whoever, tribal council or somebody in the Cherokee tribe, that they would no longer enroll them as members of the tribe. So there's a huge controversy. People in Congress have taken it up, and it's just a big mess. There were African people who became part of Native American families and their descendants as well, and all that. So they're called Black Indians. There's actually a video. It's about a 60-minute video documentary called Black Indians. And it talks about this chapter of American history that's never spoken about, that very few people know about at all. And there are tribes in the eastern part of the country where many of the descendants of those people have African American features. Some of them look African American. You'd never think they were Native. I've met some of them. We have a church in Shinnecock, Presbyterian Church in Long Island, New York. It's on Long Island. It's Southampton, New York. And I visited that congregation in 2014, and that's what I found. And I was very surprised that they explained that they had, many of their ancestors had been Africans. And so that's where they descended from. And just like any family, those traits come out here and there and everywhere. And so we also have a church just south of New York City, Brook Presbyterian Church, which has just come to our attention in the last 2 years, because before that, they were classified by their presbytery as African American because they looked African American. And in those days, there was a paternalistic society and nobody said anything. So they just lived with it. But now they've risen out of that, and now they're on my radar, my office's radar. I am actually planning on visiting them when I can travel better and all of that. But most of them are descended from Africans. And so not only in the Presbyterian Church do we have that, but many other societies, many Native American tribes around the country, mostly in the East, Southeast, have this as part of their descendants who are descended from them. And many of them settled also in the New Orleans area. And so you see on Mardi Gras that there are actually Native American people who wear those big flowing things that they walk down. They have parades in the streets. And a lot of them are reenacting this heritage that they have from Native Americans. So there's a lot out there. And the current associate for African American congregational support, who's the person that does my job, but for the African American constituents in the Presbyterian Church, he and I had this discussion about 2 weeks ago. So we're going to be working on something about this, at the very least, some kind of presentation, but also something on video to document at least what happened within our own denomination. But so watch this space. We'll have much more information coming out.
It's a
very
full
good point.
conversation. And it is an American conversation, and there's a myth of absence, and there's an elephant in the room. And so thank you very much for pressing into that.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking.
So I want to talk about group number 3. I'm not sure we have a profound question, but appreciate those of others. But we were honored to have 2 people from Arizona in our group, both of who are indigenous, and claimed that in their schooling, the things that you've talked about in these 3 weeks are things new to them as well. And so their surprise and delight was a big part of our conversation, and I thank him for that. And then the question that we had was, how do we get you on PBS? So, really a real bigger audience. We want more people to learn about this.
Yeah, exactly. I was sharing with the planning team as we were getting ready to, whenever I do these workshops, I go through the presentation with them, not at this length, but quickly, and show them the slides that I'm gonna, and the storyline of what I'm gonna do. And I told them that this idea of this particular workshop came about because I was talking to a church in Connecticut, and I was gonna go over there pre-pandemic, and I was gonna do the blanket exercise with them that some of you know about. And we got to talking about that part of the country, and I said, I started mentioning about this Thanksgiving myth, and they got very excited, and we started talking about it. And before the conversation was over, they had a date when they wanted me to do this. And obviously then once the pandemic hit, I couldn't go. So we went ahead with the date. I got ready, and I did it for the first time, this presentation, the first part of November last year for them. And so since that time, I have worked on it and added to it as well. But the idea really behind it was, do Native Americans celebrate Thanksgiving? And that was the gist of how it all came about. And then I was fortunate enough to see a presentation by the author that I mentioned, and I was just on fire for what he was telling us and kind of unpacking all that historical information about what happened. And so that's kind of how it all began and everything like that. But it has been very rewarding, because not only does it, you know, they tell you as a minister, they say, if you're having trouble with something, or you're having not understanding something, preach about it. And it's true, because in your research and in your contemplation and your meditating about it, you learn a lot of things. And so this topic has really taught me many, many things that I never, ever knew. And I'm so glad to find out. And so we just want to add to it from here on out. Thank you.
Thanks again to Reverend Porter, and thanks for the good questions. Before we turn to Pastor
one more
Spray.
group, if you.
Well, okay.
Is there time? If there's not, that's fine. We're fine.
We're starting to run short, but why don't we go ahead? Maybe people won't mind staying a few extra minutes, but
Well,
yeah, please.
just quickly, the simple question, I guess, is: do you know of any celebrations of the National Day of Mourning, any gatherings for that on the West Coast? I mean, obviously, it's not at the origin point, but
and we were talking about that earlier, a few of us, but no, I don't. There are tribes have their own types of gatherings for that. So there's many of those, obviously, but which I don't know about, but there's no national West Coast gatherings such as the one in Massachusetts. We do have people at Church of the Indian Fellowship who refuse to have anything to do with Thanksgiving, and they don't come to our dinner before the weekend before. We had a family who we were going to give a Thanksgiving dinner box to who were in need, and they wouldn't take it because they didn't want to have anything to do with that idea whatsoever. But yeah, so there's just, and that's the thing about the Native American people, is that we don't think monolithically. We don't even know what to call ourselves. Some of us call ourselves Native Americans, Indians, Indigenous, First Nations. There's just no agreeing to that. But nevertheless, there are groups of people who do their own celebrating as far as the Native American Day. Some tribes will even have powwows on that day to, I don't know, squash the memory or whatever they want to do. But I have seen where there's been powwows arranged, celebrations arranged on Thanksgiving Day. And people say, well, we got dinner and we got all this stuff going on, but that's the reason why they do it that way, is because they want it to take the place of. So, but that's really the only national one that I know of is over there. And there is a statue of him, of that Massasoit, in Kansas City, in a park there, and it's trying to, I don't know why it's there, but it is there. And I went to school not far from there, and I was surprised that why would they put a statue of an Eastern Indian in the middle of the country? I don't know, but they did, and they do. And obviously their football team is named the Chiefs, so we're still working on them to change that, just like the Redskins did. But that's the other thing, is that Native people, the country, the national sense should be that that shouldn't be allowed to have those kinds of things going on when we're trying to be more inclusive society around us, and to still have a teams that still use Native American mascots. So.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Larry. I want to thank, before we turn to Pastor Stray to close us out, I want to thank Christy for the links that she's been dropping into chat, and point out that if you want to look at those materials, you can do that in two ways. One, you can click on that link there live. It'll put it in your web browser, and you can come back to it at the end of the session. But you can also download the chat to your desktop if you go to those three dots to the right of the address for chat, and that will bring up save chat. Click on save chat, and you'll get the whole chat message with all the links and such. Pastor Stray.
Okay, just as a way of closing, we give thanks to God in the tradition of the Native American community for this day, for this gathering, for our time that we've spent together. I want to thank each and every one of you, and those who had to leave already, for your participation, your engagement today. Huge word of gratitude to Pastor Irvin Porter. We could give you a round of applause from where we are. We're just very grateful. This has been a revealing experience. This has been a powerful experience of your sharing from your heart, and also from your deep your research, your experience, and it will be something that I will remember for a long time and carry with me. Just a few of my closing thoughts. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on, a lot to lament as a nation and as faith communities. You've given us an expression of the atrocities, the sin, the injustice that is true, the truths that are there in this history, and a challenge before us. How will we each respond? How will we respond as a community? How will we tell the truth? How will we recenter indigenous worldviews? How will we seek justice? It's a journey. If you all were registered for this workshop, you will automatically get an email that will give you information about the next session. Again, a reminder, it's Tuesday, May 31st. It's the documentary Dawnland. More details to come there. You do not need to re-register if you've already registered. You will also get more information about some research and background materials for yourself. Please invite family and friends to come to the next session. All are welcome. And please go in peace this evening. We pray that we all might seek deeper understanding of the injustice of the Native American community, and that we might be all about justice, God's justice for all God's people. Thank you, and we'll see you in May, everybody. Bye.
Night. Good
Good
night.
night.
Good night.
Thanks, Reverend Porter.
You're welcome. Good night.